Kiss me, if you don't want to be discovered. Nina Carter didn't even realize she had spoken until the stranger's eyes widened. You, he stammered, clearly caught off guard. But Nina didn't give him time to finish. Before doubt could creep in, before fear could change her mind, she stepped forward and pressed her lips against his. It was sudden, completely unplanned, and for a brief second, the entire world seemed to pause. Outside Luigi's trattoria, black SUVs had just pulled up along the curb on Hanover Street. The doors were opening. Heavy footsteps echoed on the pavement as several large men began moving from shop to shop, asking questions. But inside the small Italian restaurant, Nina had already made her choice. She kissed him, not carefully, not romantically, but firmly enough that anyone looking their way would believe exactly what she wanted them to believe. The stranger froze for a fraction of a second. His body had the tense stillness of a man used to danger, used to control. Yet this had clearly not been part of his plan. Then he understood. Slowly, naturally, his arm moved around Nina's waist, drawing her closer as if the embrace belonged there. From the corner of her eye, Nina saw the restaurant door open. The men had arrived. "Check inside," one of them said. Their voices were low, rough, the kind of voices that carried authority and impatience. Nina deepened the kiss just slightly, tilting her head so that her back faced the room. Her hands rested against the stranger's chest. Through the thick fabric of his coat, she could feel his heartbeat, steady, controlled, strangely calm for a man being hunted. The men walked deeper into the restaurant. Boots thudded softly across the floorboards. "Sorry," one of them said to Luigi. "Looking for someone." Luigi's voice floated out from behind the counter. "You'll have to be more specific. This is a restaurant, not a police station." Nina fought the urge to smile. She stayed close to the stranger, their faces only inches apart now. The scent of cold air clung to his coat. Beneath it, she could smell something clean, cedar, maybe. A pair of footsteps stopped near their table. Nina felt the stranger's arm tighten slightly around her waist. "Hey," one of the men muttered. Nina didn't turn. Instead, she kissed the man again. Soft, natural, as if they had forgotten the rest of the world existed. A moment passed, then another. Finally, the footsteps moved away. "Not here," the man said. Chairs scraped. The restaurant door opened again. Cold wind swept briefly through the room. Then the voices faded into the street. The SUV's engines started, and slowly, the danger drifted away. Nina pulled back first. Her cheeks were warm, though she told herself it was only embarrassment. For a moment, the stranger simply looked at her. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had expected. Sharp, intelligent. There was something powerful in the way he observed people, as if he measured them instinctively. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Nina shrugged. They looked like they were about to turn the place upside down. His lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "You have good instincts. I work with people," she replied. "You learn to read situations." He studied her for another second. Then he said something that made her pause. "You just saved my life." Nina crossed her arms. I doubt it was that dramatic. Outside, the black SUVs were already disappearing down the street. The stranger glanced through the window to confirm it. Only then did he release his hold on her waist. "My name is Alexander," he said. "Nina." He repeated it slowly, as though committing the name to memory. "Nina." She noticed something strange then. Despite everything that had just happened, the man didn't seem shaken. Relieved, perhaps, but not frightened. It was the calm of someone who had faced danger before, many times. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out several bills, and placed them neatly on the table beside the untouched glass of water. Then he stood. Before leaving, he paused beside her. "If anyone asks," he said quietly, "tell them you were kissing your boyfriend." Nina raised an eyebrow. "That might be difficult to explain." Alexander gave a soft chuckle. "Then let's hope nobody asks." He started toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped and looked back at her. For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his expression. Gratitude, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Then he nodded once and stepped outside. The door closed behind him. Outside, the night air swallowed him quickly. The black SUVs were gone. The street had returned to its normal rhythm, people walking past, laughter drifting from nearby cafes, the distant hum of traffic along Atlantic Avenue. Inside the restaurant, Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Luigi stepped out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a white towel. "Everything all right out here, Nina?" he asked. She blinked, pulling herself back into the moment. "Yeah," she said lightly. "Just some guys asking questions." Luigi frowned. Questions about what? Someone they were looking for. Luigi shook his head and muttered something in Italian that sounded like a complaint about people bringing trouble into his restaurant. Then he disappeared back into the kitchen. Nina began clearing the table where Alexander had been sitting. The glass of water remained untouched. Beside it were the bills he had left. More money than the drink had cost. She hesitated before folding the cash and placing it into the register. For reasons she couldn't explain, the moment lingered in her mind. The man's calm voice, the way he had said her name, and the strange certainty in his words. "You just saved my life. If this moment touched you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight." Stories like this remind us that one small act of kindness can change a life. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one. Nina pushed the thought away and returned to work. But later that night, as the restaurant slowly emptied and chairs were turned upside down on the tables, she found herself glancing toward the door more often than usual, almost as if she expected him to walk back in. He didn't. Around midnight, Luigi finally waved her off. "Go home," he said. "You've done enough for today." Nina grabbed her coat and stepped outside. The cold air bit gently at her cheeks. Hanover Street was quieter now. The crowds of tourists gone, leaving only the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the old brick buildings. She walked the few blocks toward her apartment, hands tucked into her pockets. Her life had always been simple. Work, home, occasionally coffee with a friend. She liked it that way. Quiet lives had fewer complications. But that kiss, the memory crept back again. Nina shook her head with a small laugh. "You're thinking too much," she murmured to herself. By the time she reached her apartment building, she had convinced herself the entire incident was already behind her. But on the other side of the city, things were unfolding very differently. Across the Charles River, beyond the crowded streets and glowing restaurants, a long driveway curved through tall oak trees toward a private estate. A black sedan rolled through the gates. The guards at the entrance straightened immediately. The car stopped in front of the main house. Victor Romano stepped out first. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that looked more suited to a courtroom than a battlefield. He opened the back door. Alexander Ricci stepped out. The tension he had carried earlier in the evening was gone, replaced with the quiet authority that came naturally to him. Inside the house, lights were already on. A few men waited in the main room. They stood when Alexander entered. One of them spoke first. "Mr. Ricci, we lost them near the harbor." Alexander removed his coat calmly. "That was expected." Another man frowned. "They were closer than usual tonight." Victor stepped forward. "Carlo Vargas is getting impatient." The name hung in the room like a shadow. Carlo Vargas was the only man in the region reckless enough to challenge Alexander Ricci directly. Alexander walked slowly toward the window overlooking the dark lawn. "Impatience makes people careless," he said. Victor studied him carefully. "Still, that was too close." Alexander nodded slightly. "Yes." Then he added quietly, "If not for her." Victor raised an eyebrow. "The waitress?" Alexander turned from the window. For a moment something thoughtful crossed his face. She didn't hesitate. Victor allowed himself a small smile. "That's rare." Alexander poured himself a glass of whiskey from the cabinet. Most people would have walked away. Victor leaned against the edge of the table. "What made her help you?" Alexander took a slow sip. "I'm not sure she even knows." Silence settled over the room. Victor spoke again after a moment. "You want us to look into her?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the amber liquid in his glass. "Nina Carter," he said finally. The name sounded different in his voice now, more deliberate. Victor pulled out a small notebook. "Waitress. Luigi's Trattoria. North End," Alexander added. Victor nodded. "I'll have a background report by morning." Alexander finished the whiskey and set the glass down. "No." Victor looked up. "No? No investigation?" Victor seemed surprised. "Boss, you were almost taken tonight." Alexander's expression remained calm. "She helped me because she believed it was the right thing to do." Victor crossed his arms. "And?" Alexander's eyes moved toward the window again. "And I won't repay that kindness by turning her life upside down." Victor considered this for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Understood. But as the conversation ended, another voice spoke from the doorway. An older voice. You should listen to your instincts, my son. Both men turned. Don Matteo Ricci stood in the entrance. He was older now, his hair completely gray. But the presence he carried could still quiet an entire room. Alexander straightened slightly. Father, Don Matteo walked into the room with measured steps. I heard about tonight. Victor respectfully stepped aside. Don Matteo studied his son carefully. You were lucky. Alexander shrugged. I was prepared. Don Matteo smiled faintly. No man is ever fully prepared for fate. Alexander said nothing. The older man glanced toward Victor. And this young woman? Victor replied respectfully. She helped Mr. Ricci avoid Vargas's men. Don Matteo raised an eyebrow. A brave girl. Alexander poured another drink but didn't touch it. Don Matteo watched him quietly. Then he said something that made Victor look away with amusement. For 40 years, the old man said, you've refused every woman introduced to you. Alexander hid. Father, Don Matteo raised a hand. But tonight, he continued, you come home talking about a waitress. Alexander finally smiled. A small, reluctant smile. She kissed me. Victor chuckled softly. Don Matteo laughed out loud. Then perhaps destiny has better taste than we do. Alexander shook his head. It wasn't like that. Of course not, Don Matteo replied. He rested a hand on his son's shoulder. But remember something. Alexander looked at him. Power builds many things, the old man said quietly, but the right woman builds a life. Alexander didn't respond. But later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, he found himself standing again by the window, looking out into the darkness and thinking about the moment in the restaurant, the moment Nina Carter had leaned forward without hesitation and changed the direction of his night, perhaps even more than that. And across the city, in a small apartment above a bakery, Nina Carter was already asleep, completely unaware that the man she had helped escape was one of the most powerful figures in Boston, or that their brief encounter had already begun to ripple through a world far larger and more dangerous than she could imagine. Morning arrived quietly in the North End. The sun slipped between the narrow brick buildings and painted soft golden lines across Hanover Street. Bakeries opened their doors early, and the smell of fresh bread drifted through the neighborhood like a familiar greeting. Nina Carter was already awake. Her small apartment sat above a corner bakery run by an elderly couple who began their work before dawn every day. The faint rumble of ovens and the comforting scent of cinnamon rolls had become her alarm clock long ago. She stretched, brushed her hair back, and glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:30, another workday. For Nina, mornings were simple. Coffee first, then a quick shower, then the short walk back to Luigi's Trattoria, where the lunch shift began before the tourists flooded the neighborhood. She poured herself a cup of coffee and stood by the small kitchen window. Below, the street was slowly waking up. A man walked his dog. A delivery truck stopped in front of the bakery. Two construction workers laughed loudly about something Nina couldn't hear. Everything felt ordinary again. Yet as she lifted the coffee cup to her lips, the memory of the previous night returned. Alexander, the stranger, with the calm eyes, the man who had said she saved his life. Nina shook her head slightly. Don't start imagining things, she muttered. People pass through restaurants every day. Most of them she never saw again. Still, something about him lingered in her thoughts longer than it should have. She finished her coffee, grabbed her coat, and headed downstairs. The bakery owner, Mrs. Alvarez, waved from behind the counter. You're up early today. I have the lunch shift, Nina said. Mrs. Alvarez handed her a small paper bag. Take this. Fresh croissant. Nina smiled. You're spoiling me. The older woman shrugged. Kind people deserve breakfast. Nina thanked her and stepped back into the street. The North End was busier now. Tourists had started appearing with cameras and maps, while locals moved quickly toward their jobs. Luigi's Trattoria sat only a few minutes away. By the time Nina reached the restaurant, Luigi was already inside preparing the kitchen. You're late, he said without looking up. It's 8:30, Nina replied. Exactly, Luigi said. You're late for my morning complaints. Nina laughed and tied her apron. The morning passed quickly. Lunch customers arrived steadily. Families, office workers, visitors looking for authentic Italian food. Nina moved between tables with her usual calm efficiency. Yet once or twice she caught herself glancing toward the door. not expecting anything, just wondering. Around 2 in the afternoon, the lunch rush finally slowed. Nina carried a tray of empty glasses toward the bar when the restaurant door opened again. She looked up automatically. 2 men entered, not tourists, not regular customers. They wore dark suits that fit too well for ordinary businessmen. One of them was tall with broad shoulders. The other had the alert posture of someone who noticed every detail in the room. They scanned the restaurant quickly. Nina felt a small chill of recognition. Something about them reminded her of the men from the night before. The taller man approached the counter. "Good afternoon," he said politely. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Nina stepped forward. "Can I help you?" The man studied her for a moment. "Yes," he said. "We're looking for someone." Nina felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. "A lot of people come through here." The second man reached into his coat pocket. For a moment, Nina thought he might pull out a photograph. Instead, he pulled out a business card. He placed it gently on the counter. The name printed on it read, Victor Romano. Nina recognized the name instantly. The man who had come for Alexander the night before. Victor watched her expression carefully. "I believe you met Mr. Ricci yesterday evening." Nina kept her voice steady. "He ordered water." Victor allowed himself a small smile. "That sounds like him." Luigi stepped out of the kitchen just then. "Everything all right here?" Victor nodded politely. "We're just speaking with Nina." Luigi shrugged and returned to the kitchen. Victor turned back to Nina. "Mr. Ricci asked me to thank you again." Nina crossed her arms. "You drove across the city just to say thank you?" Victor's smile widened slightly. "Not exactly." He gestured toward the door. "A car is waiting outside." Nina raised an eyebrow. "For what?" Victor's tone remained calm. "Mr. Ricci would like to speak with you." Nina shook her head immediately. "I have work." Victor nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Yes," he said. "But unfortunately, other people are also looking for you." Nina felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Victor leaned slightly closer and lowered his voice. "Carlo Vargas's men were asking questions this morning." The name meant nothing to Nina, but the warning in Victor's tone did. "You helped Mr. Ricci escape," he continued. "And that makes you interesting." Nina glanced toward the window. Across the street, she noticed a dark car idling near the curb. The engine was running. 2 men sat inside, watching. Victor followed her gaze. "That's not our car," he said quietly. Nina felt the tension rise in her chest. "So what are you suggesting?" Victor picked up the business card from the counter and slid it into her hand. "I'm suggesting," he said calmly, "that the safest place for you right now is with the man you helped last night." Nina stared at the card. Her quiet life had always been predictable, simple, safe. But something deep inside her told her that safety had already disappeared the moment she kissed a stranger in Luigi's trattoria. She looked up at Victor again. "And if I say no?" Victor shrugged lightly. "Then you're braver than most people I know." He turned toward the door. "But I wouldn't recommend it." Nina stood there for several seconds after he left. The restaurant felt quieter than usual. Outside, the dark car across the street had not moved. And for the first time since last night, Nina began to understand something important. Helping Alexander Ricci had not ended when the SUVs drove away. It had only just begun. Nina stood behind the counter of Luigi's trattoria, the small white business card still resting in her hand. Victor Romano. The letters looked simple enough, printed in clean black ink, yet the name carried a weight that seemed to pull the air out of the room. Outside the restaurant window, the dark sedan across the street had not moved. 2 men still sat inside, waiting, watching. Luigi called from the kitchen. "Nina, table 3 needs the check." She blinked, forcing herself back into the present. "Coming." For the next 10 minutes, she moved through the restaurant like she always did, refilling glasses, clearing plates, smiling at customers. But her mind was somewhere else. She could feel it now. The invisible shift. Last night had been an accident, a strange moment, but today, that moment had consequences. When the lunch crowd finally cleared, Nina stepped toward the back hallway. Luigi noticed immediately. "Break already?" "Just a minute," she said. He shrugged. "Don't disappear on me." She grabbed her coat and walked outside through the side door. The cold afternoon air hit her face instantly. Boston's North End buzzed with the usual mixture of locals and tourists, but Nina's attention went straight to the black sedan across the street. It started moving the moment she stepped outside. Her stomach tightened. Victor had been telling the truth. She crossed the street slowly, pretending not to notice. The sedan rolled forward and stopped beside the curb. The passenger window lowered halfway. One of the men inside leaned slightly toward her. "Miss Carter." His voice was polite, too polite. Nina kept walking. "I think you have the wrong person." The man stepped out of the car. He was large, broad shoulders, thick neck. The kind of man who didn't spend his days behind a desk. "We just want to ask a few questions." Nina stopped. Behind her, she could hear the restaurant door opening. Luigi's voice echoed faintly. "Nina?" The man smiled. "Won't take long." Before Nina could answer, another car pulled sharply to the curb. The engine cut off. A second later, the passenger door opened. Victor Romano stepped out. His calm presence changed the atmosphere instantly. The large man beside Nina frowned. "Romano?" Victor nodded politely. "Gentlemen." There was a brief silence as both sides measured each other. Victor's tone remained friendly. "Miss Carter is busy." The larger man crossed his arms. "She helped someone last night." Victor's smile didn't fade. "Yes, and we'd like to talk about it." Victor glanced briefly toward Nina, then back at the men. "I'm afraid that conversation will not happen today." The second man inside the sedan muttered something under his breath. The large man stepped closer to Victor. "You protecting waitresses now?" Victor's voice remained calm. "I protect people who deserve it." For a moment, the tension hung in the air like a live wire. Pedestrians passed nearby without noticing. Finally, the man exhaled slowly. "This isn't over." Victor nodded. "I didn't think it was." The two men got back into their car. The sedan pulled away and disappeared into traffic. Only when it was gone did Nina realize she had been holding her breath. Victor turned toward her. "You see what I meant?" Nina looked down the street where the car had vanished. "Who are they?" "Carlo Vargas's men." The name still meant nothing to her. Victor noticed. "He's a businessman," Victor said carefully. "The kind who believes every problem can be solved with intimidation." "And Alexander?" Victor allowed himself a faint smile. "Mr. Ricci prefers different methods." Nina studied him. "So this is a war." Victor shrugged. "More like a disagreement." She looked down at the business card still in her hand. "You said Alexander wanted to speak with me." "Yes. And if I don't go?" Victor's tone remained calm. "Then men like the ones who just left will keep asking questions." Nina looked back toward the restaurant window. Inside, Luigi was wiping down a table, completely unaware of the quiet confrontation that had just taken place outside. Her life had always been simple. She liked it that way, but simplicity had already started slipping away. "What happens if I do go?" she asked. Victor opened the passenger door of the car. "You meet the man whose life you saved." Nina sighed softly. "You really believe that?" Victor met her eyes. "Yes." Nina hesitated. Her instincts told her this moment mattered. The safe choice would be to walk back into Luigi's trattoria and pretend none of this existed. But the safe choice had already vanished the moment she kissed a stranger to save him. She turned toward the restaurant door. Luigi looked up as she walked in. "You're back already?" Nina untied her apron. "I need to leave early today." Luigi frowned. "You never leave early." "I know." She placed the apron on the counter. "I'll make it up tomorrow." Luigi studied her face for a moment. Then he sighed. "Just don't bring trouble back with you." Nina gave him a reassuring smile. "I'll try." 5 minutes later, she stepped back onto the street. Victor waited beside the car. He opened the door again. Nina glanced once more toward the restaurant, toward the life that had been so predictable only yesterday. Then she got into the car. Victor closed the door gently. The engine started. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into Boston traffic. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The city slowly changed around them. The narrow streets of the North End gave way to wider roads. Traffic thinned. Buildings became larger, more private. Finally, Nina broke the silence. "Where are we going?" Victor answered simply. "To see Alexander Ricci." The car continued toward the outskirts of the city, and though Nina couldn't yet know it, the road ahead was taking her far beyond the quiet life she had known. The car ride out of the North End felt longer than Nina expected. At first, the familiar streets of Boston surrounded them: brick buildings, corner cafes, and clusters of pedestrians moving through the afternoon. But gradually, the city thinned. Traffic became lighter. The noise faded behind them. Victor drove without speaking, his hands steady on the wheel. Nina sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the scenery change outside the window. For most of her life, she had rarely left the neighborhoods she knew. Restaurants, small apartments, bakeries, and narrow streets had always defined her world. Now the road curved through quieter districts filled with large homes and tree-lined avenues. Eventually, the car turned onto a private road. Tall iron gates stood at the entrance. Two security guards stepped forward immediately when the vehicle approached. Victor lowered the window. "It's Romano," he said calmly. One of the guards nodded and pressed a button beside the gate. The metal bars slid open slowly. Nina raised an eyebrow. "You live like this?" she asked. Victor glanced at her briefly. "Mr. Ricci does." The car rolled forward through the gate and continued up a long driveway lined with tall oak trees. At the end of the drive stood a large estate, not flashy, but impressive in the quiet way that old money often was. Stone walls, wide windows, carefully kept gardens. Nina leaned back in her seat. "You weren't exaggerating," she murmured. Victor parked near the entrance. Before getting out, he looked at her. "One thing you should know." Nina waited. Mr. Ricci is not used to people refusing him. She shrugged. Then today might be educational. Victor smiled slightly. They stepped out of the car. The front door opened before they reached it. A house attendant greeted them and stepped aside. "Mr. Ricci is expecting you." Nina followed Victor inside. The interior of the house was warm and quiet. Polished wooden floors reflected the soft light of antique chandeliers. A wide staircase curved toward the upper level, and large paintings lined the walls. It didn't feel like the house of a criminal. It felt like the house of a powerful family. Victor gestured toward a room at the end of the hallway. "He's inside." Nina walked forward. Her heartbeat had begun to quicken, though she couldn't quite explain why. When she entered the room, Alexander Ricci was standing by a window overlooking the back garden. He turned when he heard her footsteps. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Nina noticed immediately that he looked different from the man she had met in the restaurant. There was no tension in his posture now, no urgency in his movements. Instead, there was quiet authority. He was exactly the kind of man people listened to without needing to be told. "Miss Carter," he said calmly. "Nina," she corrected. His lips curved slightly. "Nina." Victor remained near the doorway. Alexander gestured toward a chair. "Please sit." Nina sat, though she kept her posture relaxed. Alexander poured 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher and placed one in front of her. "I owe you an apology," he said. Nina frowned slightly. "For what?" "For the situation outside the restaurant." She shrugged. "Your friend explained it." Alexander glanced briefly toward Victor. "Vargas's men can be persistent." Nina took a sip of water. "Who is Vargas?" Alexander leaned back slightly. "A man who believes the city belongs to him. And you disagree." A faint smile appeared. Strongly. Nina studied him carefully. "You didn't bring me here just to say thank you." "No," Alexander admitted. "But I did want to say it." He met her eyes directly. "You helped a stranger without asking questions. That's usually how helping works." Alexander chuckled quietly. "I suppose it is." For a moment, the room fell silent. Nina looked around. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "this isn't what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something darker." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I try not to decorate like a villain." Nina laughed softly. The tension in the room eased. Alexander watched her carefully. "You're handling this surprisingly well. Should I be panicking?" "That's what most people do." Nina leaned back slightly. "I work in a restaurant. I've seen worse." Victor coughed quietly near the doorway. Alexander ignored him. Then Nina asked the question that had been forming in her mind since yesterday. "Why were those men chasing you?" Alexander considered his answer carefully. "Let's call it a disagreement about territory." Nina hid. "That's a very polite way to say something illegal." "Possibly." "And now they're looking for me." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Great." Alexander's tone softened. "They won't touch you. You seem very confident about that." "I am." Something in his voice made her believe him. After a moment, Nina stood. "So that's it?" Alexander looked slightly surprised. "That's it. You thanked me." "I met the mysterious Alexander Ricci." She gestured toward the door. "I should probably go back to work." Alexander stood as well. "You're not curious?" "About what?" "About the man you kissed." Nina smiled. "I'm curious." She walked toward the doorway, then paused beside him. But curiosity isn't always a good reason to get involved in someone else's world. For a brief moment, Alexander looked thoughtful. "You're wiser than most people I know." Nina shrugged. "Experience." Victor stepped forward. "I can drive you back." Nina nodded. As she walked toward the hallway, Alexander spoke again. Nina, she turned. If you ever need help, he said calmly, call Victor. She smiled. Hopefully I won't need to. Alexander watched her leave the room. Victor followed her out. For several seconds, Alexander remained standing by the window. His father's voice suddenly echoed behind him. You like her? Alexander turned. Don Matteo Ricci stood in the doorway, smiling knowingly. She's interesting, Alexander said. Don Matteo laughed softly. For 40 years you've avoided women. He gestured toward the hallway Nina had just walked down. And now the first one who kisses you becomes interesting. Alexander shook his head. It's not like that. Don Matteo smiled. That's what they all say. Alexander didn't answer. But as he returned to the window and looked out over the quiet garden, he found himself thinking again about the moment in the restaurant. The moment Nina Carter had stepped forward without hesitation and somehow changed the direction of his life. The ride back to the city was quieter than the ride out. Nina sat in the passenger seat again while Victor guided the car through the winding road that led away from the Ricci estate. The late afternoon sun hung low over Boston, turning the edges of the trees gold as they passed. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Nina watched the road ahead, thinking about the conversation she had just had with Alexander Ricci. He had been nothing like she expected. Not loud, not threatening, not even particularly intimidating. Instead, he carried something much more unsettling. Control, the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise its voice. Victor finally broke the silence. You handled that well. Nina glanced at him. Handled what? Meeting him. She shrugged. He's just a man. Victor chuckled softly. Most people wouldn't say that. Well, Nina replied. Most people don't get kidnapped by his assistant in the middle of a workday. Victor raised an eyebrow. You got in the car voluntarily, after you scared me half to death. Victor's smile widened slightly. Fair point. The car turned back toward the main road leading into the city. Boston's skyline began appearing in the distance again. Nina leaned her head slightly against the seat. So what happens now? Victor kept his eyes on the road. Now you go back to your life. That sounds nice. It usually is. She studied him for a moment. You've worked for Alexander a long time, haven't you? Almost 20 years. That's a lot of loyalty. Victor nodded. Loyalty is rare. Nina looked out the window again. My father used to say something like that. Victor glanced at her briefly. And what did you think? That loyalty should go both ways. Victor smiled again. With Mr. Ricci, it does. The car reached the edge of the north end just as the evening crowd began filling the streets again. Restaurants were lighting their outdoor lamps. Music drifted from open windows. Victor pulled over a block from Luigi's Trattoria. We'll stop here. Nina unfastened her seatbelt. Why not in front? Victor nodded toward the restaurant. Because the two men who were watching earlier are still there. Nina's stomach tightened. Still? Victor's tone remained calm. Vargas is stubborn. She exhaled slowly. So, I'm still a target. For the moment, Victor stepped out of the car and walked around to open her door. The streetlights had begun flickering on as evening settled over the neighborhood. Nina stepped onto the sidewalk. What should I do if they come back? Victor handed her another card. My number is on the back. She studied it. And if you don't answer? Victor shrugged. Then call Alexander. Nina laughed quietly. I don't think we're on that level yet. Victor's expression grew thoughtful. You might be sooner than you think. Nina slipped the card into her pocket. Thanks for the ride. Victor nodded politely. Then he returned to the car and drove away. Nina stood there for a moment before walking toward Luigi's Trattoria. Inside, the dinner rush had already begun. Luigi spotted her immediately. Finally, he shouted from the kitchen. You disappear for hours and leave me with tourists asking for gluten-free pasta. Nina tied her apron again. You survived. Barely. She grabbed a tray and stepped back into the rhythm of work. Orders, plates, laughter. The familiar noise of the restaurant wrapped around her again like a blanket. For a while, things felt normal, until the door opened. Two men stepped inside. Nina recognized them instantly. The same men from earlier. They moved through the restaurant slowly this time, pretending to study the menu, but their eyes scanned the room, looking for her. Nina kept her expression calm as she approached their table. Evening, she said politely. Can I get you something to drink? The larger of the two men smiled. Water, the exact same word Alexander had spoken the night before. Nina placed 2 glasses on the table. Her heart beat a little faster, but her voice remained steady. Anything else? The man leaned slightly forward. We were hoping to speak with you. About? Your friend. Nina folded her arms lightly. I serve a lot of customers. The second man spoke this time. Tall guy, expensive coat, trouble following him. Nina tilted her head. That sounds like half the men in Boston. The larger man chuckled. You're funny. He slid a photograph across the table. Alexander's face stared up at her from the paper. Nina didn't even glance at it. Never seen him. The man studied her carefully. You sure about that? Before Nina could answer, the restaurant door opened again. Victor Romano stepped inside. The two men stiffened. Victor walked calmly toward their table. Gentlemen, he said. The larger man sighed. You're persistent. Victor pulled out a chair and sat down with them. Only when necessary. Nina stepped back, letting the three men face each other. Customers continued eating around them, unaware of the quiet tension in the room. Victor spoke softly. Miss Carter has nothing to do with our business. The larger man shrugged. She helped him. Victor nodded. Yes. So now we're curious. Victor leaned forward slightly. Curiosity can be dangerous. The second man stood. You can't protect her forever. Victor's voice remained calm. I don't need forever. The two men exchanged glances. Finally, the larger one picked up the photograph and slipped it back into his jacket. This isn't finished. Victor nodded. I know. The men left the restaurant. Silence lingered for a moment. Then Luigi shouted from the kitchen again. Is anyone actually working out there? The tension broke instantly. Victor stood and turned toward Nina. You see why he wanted you safe. Nina exhaled slowly. I think I'm starting to. Victor nodded once. Good. He headed toward the door again. But before leaving, he paused. You might want to keep that card close. Nina touched the pocket where she had placed it earlier. Something tells me I will. Victor left the restaurant, and for the second time in 2 days, Nina Carter found herself standing in the middle of Luigi's trattoria, realizing that her quiet life had become tangled with the world of Alexander Ricci in ways she could no longer ignore. The dinner rush at Luigi's trattoria lasted well past 9 that evening. Plates clattered, glasses chimed. Laughter bounced between the narrow brick walls of the restaurant. To anyone walking past the window, it looked like an ordinary night in Boston's North End. But Nina Carter felt the difference. Every time the door opened, her eyes lifted. Every unfamiliar face made her pause for half a second. The two men had left, but the tension they carried lingered in the room like a faint smell of smoke after a fire. Around 10 o'clock, the crowd finally began to thin. Luigi wiped his hands on his apron and leaned against the counter. You okay, kid? Nina nodded while stacking plates. Why wouldn't I be? Luigi grunted. I may run a restaurant, but I wasn't born yesterday. Those guys weren't here for pasta. Nina sighed softly. They were looking for someone. Your boyfriend? Nina laughed. He's not my boyfriend. Luigi raised an eyebrow. The one you were kissing yesterday? That was situational. Luigi shook his head. Everything in life is situational. Nina carried a tray toward the kitchen. Thanks for the philosophy. You're welcome. She spent another half hour helping clean tables and wipe counters. By the time the clock reached 11, the restaurant was nearly empty. Luigi turned off half the lights. Go home, he said, before something else dramatic happens. Nina untied her apron. That would be nice. She stepped outside into the cool Boston night. The streets were quieter now. Most of the tourists had disappeared, leaving only the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional sound of laughter from nearby bars. Nina walked toward her apartment building 2 blocks away. She kept her pace steady, not too fast, not too slow. Victor's warning echoed in her mind. Curiosity can be dangerous. Halfway down the street, she heard footsteps behind her. Her shoulders stiffened slightly. She kept walking. The footsteps quickened. A voice spoke. Miss Carter. Nina turned slowly. It was Victor. Relief washed over her. You really like dramatic entrances, don't you? She said. Victor smiled faintly. I was nearby. Watching the restaurant? Yes. Nina folded her arms. That's comforting in a very unsettling way. Victor nodded toward her building. I'll walk you. You don't have to. I know. They started down the sidewalk together. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Nina asked quietly, Are they going to keep coming back? Victor answered honestly. Probably. She said, That's inconvenient. Victor glanced at her. You're handling this better than most people. I told you, she said. I work in a restaurant. Victor laughed softly. They reached the entrance of her building. Nina pulled her keys from her pocket. "Well," she said, "thanks again for the escort." Victor nodded. "Lock your door." "I always do." She stepped inside and climbed the narrow staircase to her apartment. The small space felt exactly the same as it always had. A couch near the window, a small kitchen table, a bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks. Yet somehow the room felt different tonight, as if the outside world had followed her home. She poured herself a glass of water and sat on the couch. For a long moment she stared at Victor's card lying on the table. Then her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. 3 simple words appeared on the screen. "Are you safe?" Nina stared at the message. She already knew who it was. Alexander Ricci. She typed back before she could overthink it. "Yes." A moment passed. Another message appeared. "Good." She smiled faintly, then typed again. "Your friend is very persistent. He takes his job seriously. And you?" She hesitated. "What about me? Do you take everything this seriously?" The response came quickly. "Only the things that matter." Nina leaned back against the couch. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Finally, she wrote, "And I matter?" The typing indicator appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, his answer arrived. "You saved my life. That tends to matter." Nina stared at the words longer than she expected. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. She set the phone down on the table and looked around her quiet apartment. Just 2 days ago, her life had been simple. Work, home, sleep. Now the most powerful man in Boston was texting her at midnight. She picked up the phone again. One last message appeared from Alexander. "Get some rest, Nina. Tomorrow might be interesting." She smiled slightly, then typed, "You're starting to worry me." His reply came immediately. "Good, because I think this is only the beginning." Nina set the phone down again. For the first time since meeting Alexander Ricci, she allowed herself to admit something she had been trying not to think about. Part of her wasn't afraid of what was coming. Part of her was curious. And curiosity, she knew, had a way of changing lives. Across the city, in the quiet office of the Ricci estate, Alexander stood by the window with his phone in his hand. Victor entered the room. "She's home," Victor said. Alexander nodded. "Good." Victor studied him carefully. "You're thinking about her." Alexander didn't deny it. Victor folded his arms. "You know this complicates things." Alexander finally looked up. "Yes." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And?" Alexander slipped the phone into his pocket. "And sometimes complicated things are worth it." Victor shook his head with a small smile. "I'll increase security around the restaurant." "Do that." Victor paused at the door. "You're smiling." Alexander looked back toward the dark garden outside. "Am I?" "Yes." Victor chuckled quietly. "Your father is going to enjoy this." Alexander didn't answer, but somewhere in his mind, one thought repeated itself again and again. A woman brave enough to kiss a stranger to save him might be exactly the kind of woman his father had been waiting for. The following morning arrived with the quiet calm that often comes after a restless night. Nina Carter woke before her alarm. For several seconds she lay still, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner drifted through her open window. Ordinary sounds, ordinary life. Yet Nina already knew the day would not be ordinary. She sat up and reached for her phone on the nightstand. No new messages. Part of her felt strangely disappointed. She shook the thought away and got out of bed. Within an hour, she was walking down the familiar street toward Luigi's trattoria, a cup of coffee warming her hands as the early morning air carried the chill of autumn. Luigi was already inside when she arrived. He stood behind the counter, arguing with the coffee machine. "This thing hates me," he muttered. "It hates everyone," Nina said, tying her apron. Luigi looked up. "You look tired." "I didn't sleep much." "Thinking about your mysterious boyfriend?" Nina groaned. "He's not my boyfriend." Luigi raised his hands. "Fine. The mysterious man you kissed. That was still situational." Luigi chuckled. "You keep saying that." The morning passed quietly. Breakfast customers came and went. Tourists wandered in looking for pastries. A few locals sat near the window reading newspapers while sipping espresso. By noon, the lunch crowd began arriving. Nina moved easily between tables, carrying plates and greeting customers with the same calm energy she always had. But she noticed something new. Two men sitting near the back wall. They looked like ordinary customers, yet they had each ordered only coffee, and they had been there for almost an hour. Nina recognized them immediately. Security. Victor's work. She walked past their table and murmured quietly without looking at them. "You're not very subtle," one of the men replied without lifting his newspaper. "That's the idea." Nina hid a smile and continued working. Around 1 o'clock, the door opened again. This time, the entire restaurant seemed to pause. Alexander Ricci stepped inside. He wasn't dressed like a mob boss. No bodyguards. No dark suits. Just a simple charcoal coat and a calm expression, but presence like his couldn't hide. Heads turned. Even Luigi leaned out from the kitchen. "Now that's a customer," he whispered. Nina stood frozen for half a second. Alexander spotted her immediately. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. He walked toward the counter. Nina approached slowly. "You're going to ruin my reputation," she said quietly. Alexander tilted his head. "Do you have one? Of being normal? That might already be gone." She sighed. "What are you doing here?" "Lunch. You own restaurants much nicer than this." Alexander glanced around the small room. "I like this one." Luigi appeared suddenly beside Nina. "Welcome," he said enthusiastically. "Table for one?" Alexander smiled politely. "Yes." Luigi pointed proudly to a corner table. "Best seat in the house." Alexander sat. Nina grabbed a menu, but he waved it away. "I'll take whatever you recommend." "You're trusting." "I have good instincts." Nina rolled her eyes. "I've heard that before." She returned to the kitchen and quickly prepared a plate of pasta. When she brought it out, Alexander was watching the room carefully. "You always scan the exits?" she asked. "Old habit. Dangerous life?" "Sometimes." Nina placed the plate in front of him. "Eat before it gets cold." Alexander tasted the pasta. His expression brightened slightly. "This is excellent." Nina crossed her arms. "I'll tell Luigi you said that. He'll put your name on the menu." Alexander chuckled. "That would be embarrassing." They spoke quietly for several minutes while the restaurant buzzed around them. Eventually, Nina asked the question that had been on her mind all morning. "Why did you really come here?" Alexander met her gaze directly. "To see you." She blinked. "That's not a very strategic answer." "It's an honest one." Nina leaned against the table. "You could have texted." "Texting is less interesting." Before she could respond, the restaurant door opened again, and the mood in the room shifted instantly. 3 men stepped inside. Nina recognized them. Vargas's people. The same cold eyes, the same aggressive confidence. They spotted Alexander immediately. The tallest of the 3 smiled slowly. "Well," he said, "look who we found." The restaurant fell silent. Luigi froze near the kitchen door. The 2 security men in the back slowly lowered their newspapers. Alexander didn't move. He finished another bite of pasta calmly. Then he looked up. "You should leave," he told the men. The tall one laughed. "That's not happening." He stepped closer. Nina felt the tension building like a storm about to break, but Alexander remained perfectly calm. "You're in the wrong place," he said quietly. "This is a restaurant." The man leaned over the table. "And you're in the wrong city." Before anything else could happen, the 2 customers in the back stood up. Victor entered the restaurant at the exact same moment. The balance of power shifted instantly. The 3 men looked around. Outnumbered, the tall one scoffed. "This isn't over." Alexander nodded slightly. "I know." The men left. The restaurant slowly returned to life. Luigi exhaled loudly. "I need a drink." Nina turned back toward Alexander. "You bring excitement everywhere you go." Alexander wiped his hands with a napkin. "I warned you." She studied him carefully. "You did." He stood and placed money on the table. "Thank you for lunch." "You're leaving already?" "For now." He walked toward the door, but before stepping outside, he paused. "Nina." She looked up. "My father would like to meet you." Nina blinked. "Your father?" "Yes." "That sounds dangerous." Alexander smiled. "It might be the opposite." Nina folded her arms. "I'll think about it." Alexander nodded. "I'll take that as progress." He stepped outside and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. Luigi rushed over immediately. "Who is that guy?" he demanded. Nina hid. "That," she said quietly, "is a very complicated question." That evening, the restaurant closed earlier than usual. Luigi had spent the last hour pacing around the kitchen, muttering about gangsters, broken chairs, and insurance policies. Finally, sometime after 9, He slammed the freezer door shut and pointed at Nina. That man is trouble. Nina wiped the last clean glass and placed it on the shelf. He's also a customer. Customers don't come with armed enemies, Luigi replied. She couldn't argue with that. When the lights were turned off and the last chair lifted onto the tables, Nina stepped outside into the cool night air. Boston's North End had grown quiet again. Streetlights cast warm yellow pools across the sidewalks. A breeze from the harbor carried the faint smell of salt and distant boats. Nina stood there for a moment, replaying Alexander's words in her mind. My father would like to meet you. It was a strange invitation. She had barely known the man for 2 days, and now his family wanted to meet her. Her phone buzzed. A message. Alexander, did you make it home safely? Nina smiled faintly. You're very persistent. Only when something matters. She typed back slowly. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true. She leaned against the restaurant door. Your father really wants to meet me? Yes. Why? There was a pause before the response appeared. Because he thinks you might be important. Nina raised an eyebrow. That's a lot of pressure for someone who just serves pasta. You did more than that. She sighed. You're not going to let that go, are you? Never. Before she could respond again, a black car pulled up beside the curb. Victor stepped out. Nina shook her head. You people really enjoy dramatic timing. Victor smiled politely. Mr. Ricci asked me to drive you. I didn't say yes. Victor opened the car door anyway. He said you might hesitate. Nina laughed quietly. That sounds like him. After a moment, she climbed into the car. Victor drove through the quiet streets toward the Ricci estate once again, but this time the ride felt different, less tense, more curious. When they arrived, the large iron gates opened immediately. The house lights glowed warmly against the dark evening sky. Victor parked near the front entrance. Ready? He asked. No, Nina replied honestly. But let's go anyway. Inside, the house felt alive with quiet conversation. A fire crackled in the main living room, and standing near the fireplace was an older man with silver hair and calm, thoughtful eyes. Don Matteo Ricci. Alexander stood beside him. When Nina entered, both men turned. For a moment the room was silent. Don Matteo studied her carefully. Then he smiled. So, he said, warmly, you are the woman who saved my son. Nina shrugged slightly. I kissed him. Alexander coughed quietly. That too. Don Matteo laughed. A brave woman. He gestured toward a chair. Please sit. Nina sat cautiously. Alexander remained nearby but said nothing. His father leaned forward slightly. You know who my son is? Yes. And you helped him anyway. Nina nodded. I didn't know who he was at the time. Don Matteo smiled. Sometimes destiny works like that. Nina frowned. I don't believe in destiny. Don Matteo chuckled. Neither did I when I was young. Alexander watched the conversation quietly. His father continued. My son is 40 years old. Nina glanced at Alexander. He's doing well. Don Matteo waved his hand dismissively. He runs an empire. He paused. But he has never brought a woman into this house. Nina blinked. Ever? Alexander shifted slightly. Don Matteo nodded. Not once. He leaned back in his chair. And then suddenly, a woman appears. He gestured toward her. A woman brave enough to kiss a stranger in public to protect him. Nina felt her cheeks warm slightly. That was improvisation. Don Matteo laughed again. My dear, the best decisions in life usually are. Alexander finally spoke. Father, Don Matteo held up a hand. I'm not interrogating her. He turned back to Nina. I'm thanking you. Nina relaxed slightly. For what? For reminding my son that life is more than power. Alexander hid. This conversation is going exactly where I feared. Don Matteo smiled mischievously. Of course it is. He stood slowly and walked toward Nina. His voice softened. All I ever wanted was for Alexander to find someone who could stand beside him. He looked at her kindly. Not someone afraid of him. Nina met his gaze calmly. I'm not afraid. Don Matteo nodded approvingly. I noticed. He returned to his chair. So tell me, Nina Carter. He folded his hands together. Do you plan to keep my son out of trouble? Nina looked at Alexander, then back at his father. I'll try. Alexander finally laughed. Don Matteo seemed delighted. Good. He raised a glass of wine from the table beside him. To unexpected meetings. Alexander picked up a glass as well. Nina hesitated, then accepted one. Don Matteo lifted his glass slightly. Because sometimes, he said thoughtfully. The person who saves your life. He looked at Alexander, then Nina, also becomes the person who changes it. They drank quietly. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees surrounding the Ricci estate. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to something warmer, something almost like family. Alexander walked Nina toward the door a short time later. You survived, he said. Barely, he smiled. My father likes you. That's terrifying. Alexander chuckled. Before she stepped outside, Nina turned to him. You know, she said thoughtfully. All I did was kiss a stranger. Alexander shook his head. No, he met her eyes. You did something much bigger. What's that? You walked into my life. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nina smiled. Well, she said lightly. Next time you're being chased across Boston. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Yes, try not to make it a habit. Alexander laughed softly. I'll do my best. And somewhere deep inside the quiet Ricci estate, Don Matteo watched them through the window with a satisfied smile, because after 40 years of waiting, his son had finally met the woman who might change everything. This story reminds us that courage often appears in the smallest, most unexpected moments. Nina did not know who Alexander was when she chose to help him. She simply acted out of instinct and compassion. Sometimes the choices we make in seconds can change the direction of our entire lives. The story also teaches that people are more than their titles or reputations. Behind power, wealth, or danger, there are still human hearts searching for trust, loyalty, and love. In the end, true strength is not found in control or fear, but in the courage to care for another person and to build a life based on respect, honesty, and quiet loyalty.